thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to talk about PCI and what's required in the network and security infrastructure to achieve PCI compliance. It's a topic that I talk to many of our clients around because it is really something that's very relevant for organizations. And someone who's been involved with a lot of that is Raghu Nandakumara from Illumio. And Raghu, maybe you can give a little bit about your background in PCI and what you've been doing in this space.
Sure. Thank you very much, Nicolai, and thank you to Help AG for this session. So my name is Raghu Nandakumara, and in my role, I help our prospects and our customers really kind of realize the value of segmentation and how it can help them solve their business problems, like achieving compliance for standards like PCI DSS. My background is that I worked in the financial services industry for 15 years before I joined Illumio, and I've done multiple roles within the security space there, and all of them had some form of experience in meeting compliance and regulatory requirements. And for the last few years of my time, I worked specifically within sort of the segmentation program, leading that. And as part of that, was instrumental in ensuring that we met some industry body requirements that demanded segmentation. So I have experience as a practitioner of segmentation in helping achieve sort of compliance outcomes, and now sort of as a vendor talking about how we can leverage our technologies to support that.
Yeah, so you'd be a fantastic person to give us a little bit of an insight into which kind of challenges organizations are actually facing when we're looking at achieving PCI DSS compliance. So can you give me a little bit of background on that, or a little bit of content around that?
For anyone who is familiar with the PCI DSS and the requirements around PCI DSS, they'll be aware that the place to start with PCI DSS is scoping, right? Identifying what workloads are in scope. And this is not just part of like what is part of the CDE, right, the cardholder data environment, but also what is connected to the CDE, what is security impacting, right? So this problem itself in identifying what is in scope for PCI DSS is almost like the single biggest challenge in order to make that progress towards achieving that compliance, right? And often what we find here is that organizations fall into one of two traps, right? They either overscope that, saying, well, I have a flat network, I have a large enterprise network, everything can connect to everything potentially because that's what my network setup allows, and hence the entire estate is in scope, right? So that's kind of you're on one side of that problem, and then what happens is that the size of the auditable estate is significant, and it potentially becomes overwhelming, and it's extremely expensive or potentially even cost prohibitive to be able to audit that and achieve compliance properly. So that's one end of the scale. The other end of the spectrum is organizations sometimes underestimate what is in scope, right? And by doing that, the risk of failing an audit is high. So what do organizations do? Well, they usually err on the side of caution and they include everything, because passing the audit, ensuring and continuously validating PCI DSS compliance is far more important to the business, but not just to their business, but also to everyone that is transacting with them, their upstream and downstream dependencies. And that's far more important than the cost.
You know, another thing which when we talk to customers about PCI DSS compliance is, of course, that typically these systems that are in scope of the audit and also the where the compliance needs to be in compliance, very often they are interconnected, right? And one of the things that is often a big challenge, not just in PCI DSS, but in any kind of micro-segmentation challenge that you get into, is how do you actually, what communicates where? And I would assume that that's also a major challenge for PCI DSS.
Absolutely right. So if we kind of go back to that, what that fundamental problem is, right? It's determining what is in scope, right? What is part of the CDE, what is connected, what is security impacting. So if we kind of go back in time, this would be, how do you define that scope would often have been a paper exercise, right? I know that this is part of my CDE. My assumption is that this set of systems are the connected systems, and I think that these other systems are security impacting, providing security services. So I'm going to assume that this is what is in scope and work on the back of that. Right now, again, right, if we go back to the traps, you're either potentially over-scoping, under-scoping, and that comes with the challenges that we've already described. However, if you think about what is possible today, right, really that guesswork about what is in scope, we can eliminate the guesswork. Right. And the way we do that is we start off with an accurate asset inventory. Right. So let's start off with at least modeling what we 100% know. We know that this following set of systems represent that organization's CDE. Right. And we have that in our asset inventory, in our CMDB, and we have all the metadata associated with that. We know what application that particular workload runs. We know what type of data it's handling. We know whether it's production or development, etc. Right. So that's our starting point. The next thing is that now we want to eliminate the guesswork around what is connected, right? What is security impacting? So the way we do that is that we use telemetry, right? So we use flow data that we're sourcing not from just kind of specific points in our network infrastructure, right? Specific routers, etc., but really from the individual workloads themselves, right? Because we now have the ability to say, right, at scale, collect that telemetry, and the Illumio core platform very much allows that, using the Venn, the agent, right, allows us to collect real-time connection telemetry about our assets. So if we combine the asset inventory with the telemetry data, we're able to build an application dependency map, right? And that application dependency map allows us to look from a contextual perspective what the dependencies are. So now, as the person who is trying to identify what is in scope, I have a very clear view of what specifically my application's upstream and downstream dependencies are. And that allows me to very clearly define what is in scope, both in terms of what is the CDE, what are the connected systems, and what are the security impacting systems. And with that real-time validated information, I can now start making good decisions.
If you look at the data that's in scope and the systems that are in scope for this, I could imagine that there's also quite a lot of development of where those systems are sitting. You know, we used to be able to kind of think about it sitting inside our little security zone inside our data center, but as cloud services are also impacting financial services, right? We also see that kind of data going into systems sitting in the cloud. So how do you address also that element with the solution?
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think and that's a really important point, because for a long time, this whole concept of saying, let's say, this is what is in scope, this is my CDE, right? The assumption was that the CDE would sit in a nice little corner of the network, right, of our data center, or of our production and contingency data centers, and you could go to a rack and say, this is what's here, my CDE. That's my PCI rack, yeah. Right? And this is in scope of PCI DSS. Now, we know that as organizations are increasingly global, right? As kind of there are various sort of not just PCI DSS, but also data protection sort of directives from different sort of regional regulatory bodies, right? That restrict where data can be processed for a particular jurisdiction, right? And then, of course, as you said, the proliferation of sort of cloud computing, right? So data is not necessarily processed in our data centers anymore, but it's in the cloud. That ability to go and point to a particular rack and say, this is the CDE and this is in scope of PCI DSS, that doesn't exist anymore, right? So we have to absolutely be mindful of the fact that this data can exist anywhere, right? And then the challenge that then comes with that, obviously, right, is that then how do we segment? Right? Your data runs everywhere. We can't now just put nice kind of network-based controls around our rack or servers in a specific rack to achieve that segmentation. So we need to think almost literally outside the rack, outside the box, to think about how we can achieve both the discovery and then the segmentation of it. And that's really where kind of like sort of micro-segmentation technologies like Illumio are really moving towards to enable.
Yeah, there's no doubt that if you look at segmentation policy capabilities, we always thought about it being a network functionality that we would kind of deliver from the network, whether that was creating a VLAN where we would put our servers inside of that specific VLAN and then say that's my PCI zone, or if that was a function delivered from an SDN-enabled infrastructure or software-defined data center, or there's many ways you can think about it. But when that data center is everywhere, of course, it makes sense to do this in a very different way, where you make that control in the software instead, which probably also brings me to a little bit of maybe anecdotal, but when I talk to clients, very often I hear that they are having challenges meeting the requirements of these governance frameworks because they're reliant on something like the network infrastructure below. So can you talk a little bit about how you deal with that complexity of that?
Absolutely, right. So I'm going to kind of give an example of that point first, and then we're going to frame that within the context of PCI DSS. Okay. So first of all, in fact, this particular kind of discussion this point you just brought up, this is a discussion I was having with one of our customers earlier today, right? So if you think about a traditional sort of network-based approach, right, it's very much kind of on the assumption that you are only going to be enforcing controls on the network boundary, right? So let's say on your VLAN boundary, for example, right? Now, that then assumes that everything within a specific VLAN is in the same kind of trust zone, right? And I'm using sort of this concept of trust zone very loosely. It could mean a whole plethora of things, right? So that's the first thing. So the challenge is that anything within a particular kind of subnet effectively cannot be segmented from itself unless you start doing you start re-architecting the design of your network to be able to shoehorn in controls within a VLAN, right? The next thing is that once you start trying to segment things at the network, right, you start having lots of different touch points that you need to go and configure in order to achieve true micro-segmentation. Right? And you can imagine that as you have more and more workloads dotted in different parts of your organization, the complexity of that increases, right? You have lots and lots of touch points to maintain, to manage, which means that the risk of falling out of scope, right? If suddenly you're not protecting something you should, or causing application issues, if you're suddenly got a control that shouldn't be applied to something, the risk of that increases. So your availability risk, your operational risk increases with that complexity. So if we now go back to that context of where did we start with? We established an asset inventory, right? We used the tool to build the application dependency map, right? Now, if that tool also then has the ability to take that application dependency map that you've built, that you've used to identify your CDE, the components connected to the CDE, and the security impacting services, right? Once you've identified those dependencies, host-based segmentation controls like the Illumio platform then have the ability to quite literally in one click draw essentially boundaries around these islands, right? The CDE, the connected CDE, and your security impacting systems that allows you to put in place segmentation policies that are based on the telemetry that you've collected. So you're building policies that ensure that what you need to run your application is included, and everything else is blocked. So you're able to, regardless of where these components run, you're able to essentially segment that infrastructure effectively from a single control point. So in a relatively low touch manner, you're able to move from not having any kind of understanding of the dependencies in your infrastructure to be able to map out the necessary kind of what is in scope for PCI DSS, and then segment it so that you know exactly what is in scope, and you're able to confirm that that's controlled, and then perform your PCI DSS auditing on that. And then the rest of your infrastructure is out of scope and can also not connect in to your to the in-scope infrastructure.
Yeah, let's also face it, right? Putting in those network controls can be extremely time consuming. So, replacing a data center fabric can take years, and it may not be that we have that time when we're looking at PCI audits, right? It may need to be something that you need to fix in 6 months' time. So obviously, not having to wait for the network infrastructure to be able to do this kind of enforcement actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And I think the other thing there is that depending on the network infrastructure, you're putting a dependency on having that homogeneous network infrastructure everywhere before you can start making progress, right? And that's kind of where the beauty of sort of the host-based approach to it, an application-centric approach to it, essentially you're abstracting away from the network. So you can have that same type of control whether you are on your physical infrastructure, your private cloud, public cloud, right? That it really gives you that flexibility.
Another key thing that you benefit from is, of course, also that in order to potentially make changes to that environment, you don't need to go to the firewall guy and get them to make those changes. Mm-hmm. Now you can actually delegate that to the application owners or to the individuals who's really taking care of that compliance for that specific system.
Absolutely, right. But even more than that, because you're now really using your metadata, right, to drive policy, right? If you are sort of invested enough in things like automation or orchestration, right, you can really even get to the point where, let's say you're deploying more capacity because it's, let's say, a sort of a big sale weekend, right? You're able to deploy that capacity, ensure that the new workloads that you're spinning up have the same asset data, right? They get all the same policy. They're part of all the same sort of application dependency bubbles that you've already built out, right? And you're able to very elastically grow your infrastructure and also ensure that the controls around that also elastically grow and shrink back as required, right? And now just put that into the context of how would you do that if you were dependent on having to do network changes to achieve the same thing, right? That the complexity of that is significant.
Yeah. Which brings to the next question, which is really about validation. How do you validate that your security policy is actually meeting the requirements? So can you maybe try to cover that a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I think here, really the power of some of these capabilities is if we go back to something like the application dependency map, right? Now, remembering, right, that application dependency map is really a combination of asset inventory data, right, and real-time flow data, right? So those two pulled together, you're able to put in front of an application owner or an auditor, right, a picture of what the real dependencies are at any point in time for your CDE, right? So that's a very powerful capability to have just straight up front, right? The next thing is that being able to then essentially use that dependency map to write policy, right? But then also overlay policy on top of the dependency map to show exactly what traffic is matching policy, right? And what traffic is being dropped, is being blocked because it does not match policy, allows for a regulator to not just look at the dependencies, but also validate that the controls you have in place are actually functioning as expected. So for example, if they wanted to validate that external connectivity into the CDE was not possible unless it's from an authorized system, they could look at the application dependency map, they could look at the flow data, right? And ask questions using the metadata available to say, is this traffic being permitted? Right. So you have in a with that view, with kind of putting that focus on the asset data and the flow data and building that picture, you're also giving the regulator, the auditor, the application owner, the ability to continuously validate that the control is in fact effective.
Perfect. I think you highlighted some really good points. Our own experience from working with Illumio is really, we've been able to achieve more in months than we were able to achieve in years before for clients. So from that perspective, it's really been interesting, and probably even to a much larger depth than we could ever have done just relying on network-based controls. So some of the key takeaways here is really about that you do not necessarily just need to rely on your network infrastructure to make this kind of segmentation, and it is really possible to make sure that you follow those systems around and be able to create your policy around the systems instead of really having to rethink the whole plumbing of your infrastructure to create micro-segmentation.
Absolutely. So I think I'd say that if we were to give the audience, right, really 3 key takeaways, right, around this is firstly, right, invest in the asset inventory, right. At the very least, start off with identifying what is in your CDE, right. Use that asset data and flow data in order to build an application dependency map, right. That will give you the most accurate picture of the connected systems, of your security impacting systems, and overall allow you to build a very accurate picture of what is in scope, right? And then use that to then build the actual segmentation policy that is going to protect the in-scope, the PCI in-scope infrastructure. And once you've done all that, you then have the building blocks to then continuously validate that and continuously refine that as required.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Raghu. That was really interesting to hear from someone who's been involved with implementing this for many years and probably seen all of the bad things and all of the good things and how this can be achieved.
Thank you very much, Nicolai. My pleasure.